بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. فأقول طالبا من الله التوفيق فيما هنالك. الخبر عند علماء هذا الفن مرادف للحديث، وقيل الحديث ما جاء عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم، والخبر ما جاء عن غيره. ومن ثم قيل لمن يشتغل بالتواريخ وما شاكلها الإخباري، ولمن يشتغل بالسنة النبوية المحدث. وقيل بينهما عموم وخصوص مطلق، فكل حديث خبر من غير عكس، وعبر هنا بالخبر ليكون أشمل. After presenting an overview on earlier books and stating the reasons why he contributed another book to this field, Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah says, فَأَقُولُ طَالِبًا مِّنَ اللَّهِ التَّوْفِيقَ فِيمَا هُنَالِكَ. I now commence and say with the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In Nukhbatul Fikr, Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah merely said, Al-Khabaru imma yakuna lahu turuqun, that a khabar could either have multiple paths. So a person might wonder that why is the author mentioning a khabar when our intention is to learn usulul hadith. Therefore, Ibn Hajar rahimahullah begins by clarifying that khabar and hadith is the same thing. Both have the same meaning. Khabar has the exact same meaning as hadith. And hence he says, Al-Khabaru inda ulama'i hadha al-fanni muradifun lil-hadith. Khabar, according to the scholars of this field, is synonymous with hadith. However, this definition is not sufficient, as the author neither explains what is meant by a hadith, and nor does he expound on the meaning of a khabar. Then this ambiguity is compounded when we remember that the author indicated just a few lines earlier that this book is actually for beginners. And as such, it is unlikely that a beginner will know the full and accurate meaning of hadith. So Ibn Hajar rahimahullah is giving the definition of a term, khabar, using another word which is hadith, but that word is also undefined. In English, we call this a circular definition. To understand this, take the following example. So say Zaid has no knowledge of the science of medicine. Now Amr speaks to Zaid about February. So Zaid asks Amr, what is this February that you are talking about? And Amr responds and say, it is a deficiency of the enzyme alpha-galactosidase. Now Amr's definition of February is inadequate, because it is unlikely that Zaid has learned anything or understood him. Zaid would still not know the definition of February, since he has no knowledge of medical terms, and Amr just defined one difficult term with another term that is not understood. Similarly, stating that khabar has the same meaning as hadith is unhelpful for beginners who have no prior knowledge of usulul hadith. Therefore, it would have been better to first define one of the two terms. Mullah al-Qari rahimahullah says, وَقِيلَ الْأَوْلَى أَن يُبَيِّنَ مَعْنَى الْحَدِيثِ ثُمَّ يَقُولُ وَالْخَبْرُ يُرَادِفُهُ. It is said that first he should clarify the meaning of hadith, and thereafter he could have then said that khabar has the same meaning. Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah probably thought that a person is entering into the field of ulumul hadith, and hence he would at least be acquainted with the basic terminology, and he felt that the meaning is quite apparent. وَتَرَكَ التَّعْرِيفَ لِلْوُضُوحِ أَوْ اعْتِمَادًا عَلَى مَا يُفْهَمْ مِنَ الْمَتْنِ. That he left the definition out because of its obviousness, or just relying upon what is understood from the text from Nukhbatul Fikr. Nevertheless, it is best for us to begin by explaining these two terms so that we may understand the meaning fully. So to begin with the word khabar, the literal meaning of khabar is ما ينقل ويتحدث به. ما ينقل ويتحدث به, that which is related and is spoken about. In English, we translate this as information. So it is also used as a synonym with the word naba, which means news and detail. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the word Khabar in this meaning. So for example, in Surah Tawbah, in verse number 94, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قُلْ لَا تَعْتَذِرُوا لَن نُؤْمِنَ لَكُمْ قَدْ نَبَّأَنَا اللَّهُ مِنْ أَخْبَارِكُمْ. So you can see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used the word نَبَّأَ, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used the word akhbar. Likewise in Surah Kahf in verse number 68, وَكَيْفَ تَصْبِرُ عَلَى مَا لَمْ تُحِطْ بِهِ خُبْرًا. In verse number 91 of Surah Al-Kahf, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كَذَلِكَ وَقَدْ أَحَطْنَا بِمَا لَدَيْهِ خُبْرًا. Likewise in Surah Namal in verse number 7, إِذْ قَالَ مُوسَى لِأَهْلِهِ إِنِّي آنَسْتُ نَارًا سَآتِيكُم مِّنْهَا بِخَبَرٍ. I shall go there and I shall bring for you some information. Likewise in Surah Qasas in verse number 29, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَعَلِّي آتِيكُم مِّنْهَا بِخَبَرٍ أَوْ جَذْوَةٍ مِّنَ النَّارِ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَصْطَلُونَ. He quotes from Musa alayhi salam that Musa alayhi salam is saying that maybe I can bring for you khabar, some information, or an ember of fire, so that you may warm yourself. Likewise in Surah Zalzala in verse number 4, يَوْمَئِذٍ تُحَدِّثُ أَخْبَارَهَا. Likewise in many verses Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also refers to himself as Khabir, which has the meaning of one who has information. So in Surah Mujadala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse number 3, وَاللَّهُ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ خَبِيرٌ. In Surah Ahzab in verse number 2, إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ خَبِيرًا. In Surah Mulk in verse number 14, وَهُوَ اللَّطِيفُ الْخَبِيرُ. In Surah Hujurat in verse number 13, إِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلِيمٌ خَبِيرٌ. In Surah Fatir in verse number 31, إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ بِعِبَادِهِ لَخَبِيرٌ بَصِيرٌ. So this is with regards to the literal meaning of the word Khabar. It has the meaning of information. Looking at the word Ḥadīth, Ḥadīth has three different meanings. It could either mean speech, or it could refer to new things, recent things which just came about, what we would call innovations. And the third meaning is that it could be used interchangeably with the word Khabar. It could also come in the meaning of information. So we'll take a closer look at each of these literal meanings in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mostly used the word Ḥadīth for speech. It comes in a meaning of speech around 20 times in the Noble Quran. So for example, in Surah Baqarah in verse number 76, قالوا أتحدثونهم بما فتح الله عليكم. So أتحدثونهم, these words are derived from a hadith, that do you tell them. So you see it come in the meaning of speech. In Surah Nisa in verse number 78, لا يكادون يفقهون حديثا. Again, that they do not seem to understand any speech. So it comes in the meaning of speech. In verse number 18, in verse number 87 of Surah An-Nisa, وَمَنْ أَصْدَقُ مِنَ اللَّهِ حَدِيثًا. Who is more truthful in his speech, in his word, than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In verse number 140 of Surah An-Nisa, فَلَا تَقْعُدُوا مَعَهُمْ حَتَّى يَخُوضُوا فِي حَدِيثٍ غَيْرِهِ. You should not sit with them unless they start to speak about something else, unless they indulge in some other speech. In Surah Al-An'am in verse number 68, فَأَعْرِضْ عَنْهُمْ حَتَّى يَخُوضُوا فِي حَدِيثٍ غَيْرِهِ. In Surah Al-Mursalat in verse number 50, فَبِأَيِّ حَدِيثٍ بَعْدَهُ يُؤْمِنُونَ. In Surah Al-Kahf in verse number 6, إِن لَمْ يُؤْمِنُوا بِهَذَا الْحَدِيثِ أَسَفًا. In Surah Luqman in verse number 6, وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَن يَشْتَرِي لَهْوَ الْحَدِيثِ. In Surah Al-Ahzab in verse number 53, again it's used in the meaning of speech. فَإِذَا طَعِمْتُمْ فَانْتَشِرُوا وَلَا مُسْتَأْنِسِينَ لِحَدِيثٍ. In Surah Zumar in verse number 23, Allahu nazzala ahsan al-hadith. Allah sent down the best of speeches. So many verses Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is using the word hadith in the meaning of speech. In Surah Tur, in verse number 34, فَلْيَأْتُوا بِحَدِيثٍ مِثْلِهِ إِن كَانُوا صَادِقِينَ. In Surah an-Najm, in verse number 59, أَفَمِنْ هَذَا الْحَدِيثِ تَعْجَبُونَ. In Surah Al-Waqi'ah, in verse number 81, أَفَبِهَذَا الْحَدِيثِ أَنْتُمْ مُدْهِنُونَ. So we're going through all of these verses because the whole field, this whole science is known as ulumul hadith. So you should understand properly how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used the term in the Quran. In Surah Tahrim, in verse number 3, وَإِذْ أَسَرَّ النَّبِيُّ إِلَى بَعْضِ أَزْوَاجِهِ حَدِيثًا. In Surah Al-Qalam, in verse number 44, فَذَرْنِي وَمَن يُكَذِّبُ بِهَذَا الْحَدِيثِ. In Surah Al-Mursalat, in verse number 50, فَبِأَيِّ حَدِيثٍ بَعْدَهُ يُؤْمِنُونَ. So this is the one meaning, that it comes in the meaning of speech. Then the second meaning is that it's used for new things, for innovations, and this is how it has been used in a narration of Sahih Muslim. وَشَرُّ الْأُمُورِ مُحَدَّثَاتُهَا. The worst of practices are those which are new innovations, new practices in Islam. And then the third meaning is that it's used interchangeably with hadith. So in the Quran, it comes in this meaning also in numerous places. In verse number 9 of Surah Taha, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَهَلْ أَتَاكَ حَدِيثُ مُوسَى. Has the news of Musa alayhi salam reached you? Likewise in Surah Zariyat, in verse number 24, هَلْ أَتَاكَ حَدِيثُ ضَيْفِ إِبْرَاهِيمَ الْمُكْرَمِينَ. Has they come to you the news of the honored guests of Ibrahim alayhi salam? And in normal speech too, Khabar and Hadith are frequently used interchangeably and with the same meaning. So this was with regards to the literal meaning. Now looking at the technical meaning, Mullah Liqari rahimahullah quotes from Allama Sakhawi rahimahullah that the technical meaning is قول رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وفعله وتقريره وصفته حتى في الحركات والسكنات فاليقظة والمنام. So it refers to قول رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, the statements of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, وفعله, his actions, وتقريره, his tacit approvals and affirmations, وصفته, his qualities, حتى في الحركات, even his movements, والسكنات, and his pauses, and whether all of this was whilst he was awake or whilst he was sleeping. So it refers to everything of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It even includes the attributes and the qualities of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Hafiz ibn Hajar rahmallah wrote in Fathul Bari under the chapter of Kitab al-I'tisam bil Kitab was Sunnah that ومما أنبه عليه هنا قبل شرح هذه الزيادة أن ظاهر سياق هذا الحديث أنه موقوف، لكن القدر الذي له حكم الرفع منه قوله وأحسن الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم، فإن فيه إخبارا عن صفة من صفاته صلى الله عليه وسلم. That this here is informing you about a quality of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم وهو أحد أقسام المرفوع، وقل من نبه على ذلك وهو كالمتفق عليه. It still falls in the definition of marfu'. Marfu' means that it falls under the attributes of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it basically refers to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Why? And he says that very few scholars have mentioned about this here, but it is something which is almost as if it is agreed upon. وَلِتَخْرِيجِ الْمُصَنِّفِينَ الْمُقْتَصِرِينَ عَلَى الْأَحَادِيثِ الْمَرْفُوعَةِ الْأَحَادِيثِ الْوَارِدَةِ فِي شَمَائِلِهِ صلى الله عليه وسلم. Because those who only wanted to mention things concerning the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they also brought the ahadith on the shama'il of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In the Hashia of Nazm al-Durar, Allama Suyuti rahmallah says that there is consensus that everything from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, including all of his features, it's all included in the definition of hadith. Mullah Liqari rahmallah then quotes from Al-Khulasa, and he says, أو الصحابي أو التابعي. It also applies to a sahabi and even to a tabi'i. So this extends the definition of hadith to beyond the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allama al-Laqani rahimahullah, he also defined it by aiding the actions and the statements of the Sahaba and Tabi'in. So look at his definition. He says, وَالْحَدِيثُ عَلَى هَذَا مَا أُضِيفَ إِلَى النَّبِيِّ صلى الله عليه وسلم أو إلى صحابي أو إلى من دونه قولا له صلى الله عليه وسلم أو فعلا أو تقريرا أو صفة فيشمل المرفوع والموقوف. So you can see it refers to everything that is attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and even to the companions and to the successors, even to the Sahaba and to the Tabi'in. However, in Al-Yawaqit wa Durar, Allama Munawi rahimahullah said, وَالْخَبْرُ مَا جَاءَ عَنْ غَيْرِهِ مِنْ صَحَابِيٍّ أَوْ مَنْ دُونَهُ فَلَا يُطْلَقُ الْحَدِيثِ عَلَى غَيْرِ الْمَرْفُوعِ. He's saying that very specifically you will have to use the word Khabar for anything that is transmitted from the Sahaba or from anyone below the Sahaba that refers to the Tabi'in and others. You cannot use the word Hadith for actions and statements or anything attributed to the Sahaba illa bishart al-taqyid, unless you qualify it and you say that هذا حديث موقوف أو مقطوع. You add the words موقوف and مقطوع. And after that it says وهذا ما عليه كثيرون, that majority of the scholars hold this view. In Sharh Lughat al-Muhaddith on page 84, Shaykh Tariq ibn Iwadullah, he says, now here we quote from Shaykh Tariq ibn Iwadullah, but you must understand that when we're quoting from a scholar, then it does not mean that we approve of all of his views. Rather, if you are a beginner in the field, then if you want to buy any book or if you want to read any book, then it's best that you always first consult with your teachers or with those who studied more in the field. And later on, then you can read all these other books. So nevertheless, Tariq ibn Iwadullah, he says that the proof that the actions of the Sahaba and Tabi'in are all included in the term Hadith is that many famous statements have been quoted from numerous scholars stating that they memorized hundreds of thousands of ahadith. For example, Alama Khatib rahimallah, Ibn Asakir rahimallah, and Ibn Adi rahimallah, etc. They have narrated with their chains to Imam Bukhari rahimallah that he said, أحفظ 100,000 حديث صحيح وأحفظ 200,000 حديث غير صحيح. I have memorized 100,000 authentic narrations and 200,000 narrations which are not authentic. So regarding this here, Allama ibn Salah rahmallah says, هذه العبارة قد يندرج تحتها عندهم آثار الصحابة والتابعين. The statement includes the statements and actions of Sahaba and Tabi'in. And yet he used the word Hadith. So Tariq ibn Iwadullah then says, لأنه إذا جمعت الأحاديث الصحيحة لا يمكن أن تصل إلى هذا العدد وكذلك الضعيف لا يمكن أن تصل إلى هذا العدد فعرفنا أن الإمام البخاري حيث قال هنا حديث إنما قصد بكلمة الحديث المرفوعات والموقوفات والمقاطع. He says that if you have to gather and count all the authentic narrations which are from the Prophet ﷺ, it will not even come close to 100,000. So therefore it means that Imam Bukhari rahimahullah, when he used the word hadith, he said أحفظ 100,000 حديث صحيح, then he's also referring to that which is transmitted from the Sahaba and the Tabi'in. Shaykh Tariq then quotes a statement of Imam Ahmad rahmallah saying that there are 700,000 authentic narrations and Abu Zur'a rahmallah knows 600,000 by heart. قد حفظ 600,000 حديث. So you can see he's using the word hadith, but it can't be 600,000 statements which are attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He quotes with a reference to Tahzib al-Kamal that Imam al-Bayhaqi rahimahullah said, وَإِنَّمَا أَرَادَ وَاللَّهُ أَعْلَمْ مَا صَحَ مِنْ أَحَادِيثِ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صلى الله عليه وسلم وَأَقَاوِيلِ الصَّحَابَةِ وَفَتَاوَى مَنْ أَخَذَ عَنْهُمْ مِنَ التَّابِعِينَ. He intends, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best, authentic narrations from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, statements of the Sahaba, and verdicts of those who took from them, that is from the Tabi'in. So from these statements we know that the scholars use the word hadith in the broad sense. That is, that the statements and actions of the Sahaba and Tabi'in are also included within these terms. However, with regards to taqreer, the approval and disapproval of Sahaba and Tabi'in, there is a difference of opinion. In Al-Wasit fi Ulumi wa Mustalah al-Hadith, Sheikh Muhammad Abu Shuhba, he says that many scholars do not include the taqreer of Sahaba under the definition of mawquf, because it is only the taqreer of the Prophet ﷺ that is a hujjah. So this means that if the Prophet if something was taking place in the presence of a Sahabi and he just maintained silence, then we cannot necessarily say that he agreed with that action. But this is in contrast to the Prophet ﷺ. Because the Prophet ﷺ, if something took place in his presence and it contradicted Sharia, then the Prophet ﷺ most definitely would have objected, and he would have alerted that person that he is doing something which contravenes the Sharia. So this is what he mentions, that the taqreer of Sahaba are not included. But then on the other hand, in the beginning of Mishkat, when you are doing the Ulum al-Hadith of Mullah Abdul Haq al-Dahlawi rahimahullah, then he says there that Hadith can refer to the actions and statements and the taqreer of Sahaba. So that would mean that Sahaba radiallahu anhum also had this kind of temperament, that they would not be able to bear if something was being done wrong in front of them. They would not be able to remain silent. They would immediately disapprove of it and they would have objected. So Mullah Abdul Haq Dahlawi rahmallah, he further says that hadith can also refer to the statements and actions and the taqreer, the tacit approvals and disapprovals of the tabi'in. Likewise, in Sharh al-Dibaj al-Madhab fi Mustalah al-Hadith on page 7 of the old print, Mullah Shamsuddin al-Tabrizi, so this is the commentary of Dibaj al-Madhab of Sheikh Sharif al-Jurjani. He says that وَمَعْنَى تَقْرِيرُ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صلى الله عليه وسلم مثلا أنه فعل أحدا فعلا عند رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, that a person done something in the presence of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, وَقَدْ اطَّلَعَ عَلَيْهِ, and the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم knew, he managed to pay attention to what is happening around him. وَلَمْ يَنْهَهُ عَنْهُ, and the Prophet ﷺ did not prohibit him. بل سكت, the Prophet ﷺ rather maintained silence. وَيُعْلَمُ مِنْهُ تَقْرِيرُ الصَّحَابِيِّ وَالتَّابِعِيِّ أيضا. So you can see, he's saying that also the taqreer of a Sahabi and Tabi'i also falls under this. فَأَقْسَامُ الْحَدِيث تِسْعَةٌ. So then there are 9 things which falls under the definition of hadith. ثلاثة منها ما جاء عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قولا وفعلا وتقريرا. So the qawl, fi'l and taqreer of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, those are 3. Then qawl, fi'l and taqreer of a sahabi, so that's an additional 3. Then qawl, fi'l and taqreer of a tabi'i, so it becomes 9. And this here is the more authentic view, which we will discuss further when we reach the relevant chapter. To sum it up, we can just see how broad the term hadith is. However, for the sake of simplicity, you may define hadith as ما أضيف إلى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وأصحابه وتابعيهم. Anything that is attributed to the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, or anything that is attributed to a sahabi, or anything that is attributed to a tabi'i, it will fall under the definition of hadith. So this would also be the definition of khabar, according to those who claim that khabar is synonymous with hadith. Thus, a khabar would be defined as al-khabaru ma udifa ila Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam wa ashabihi wa tabi'ihim. Now, just as khabar and hadith are used interchangeably linguistically, they are also technically used in the same meaning. So therefore now if we go to the text, we can see Hafiz ibn Hajar rahmallah says that عند علماء هذا الفن مرادف للحديث, that khabar according to the scholars of this field is synonymous with hadith. أي بحسب عرفهم ومتفهم خطابهم. This here is when you look at their usage and how they would apply the words when they were discussing it. So Hafiz ibn Hajar rahmallah first mentioned this in Nukhba as the only meaning of khabar. that Khabar, and therefore he says that al-Khabaru imma yakuna lahu turuq. So that means it comes in this meaning. And he also authenticated this view. Alama al-Qani rahmallah says, قال المؤلف وبعض تلامذته والقول بالترادف هو الصحيح. Verbally also, Ibn Hajar rahmallah said that this here is the more correct view, that Khabar and Hadith have the exact same meaning. So then a question arises that why did Hafiz ibn Hajar rahmallah state it in such a broad way and with such generalization when there is a difference of opinion? Not all scholars agree to this. He's just saying al-khabru inda ulama'i hadha al-fanni muradifun lil hadith. But there is a difference of opinion among scholars. In fact, so Hafiz ibn Hajar himself is mentioning in the next line that there are other views. So he could have rather said inda akthar al-ulama or inda al-jumhur, that according to most of the ulama or according to majority of the scholars. But here he just said al-khabru inda ulama'i hadha al-fanni muradifun lil hadith. So he just said that according to scholars of this field. He didn't stipulate it that some scholars or most scholars, etc. So the answer to this is Mullah Ali Qari rahmallah said وَفِيهِ إِشَارَةٌ إِلَى الْمُبَالَغَةِ فِي تَضْعِيفِ الْقَوْلَيْنِ الْأَخِيرَيْنِ. That there is a subtle indication and an emphasis to show that how weak the other two views are. And then also note that for the next view, Hafiz ibn Hajar rahmallah is using the sighatul tamrid. He's using the word qila, which again indicates that the second two views are weak or that they are not the views of scholars of hadith. وهذا إذا جعل القائل في قيلة من علماء هذا الفن وأما لو جعل من غيرهم فلا حاجة إلى التفسير بالجمهور. Probably maybe when he's talking about these other meanings, maybe it's according to other scholars, maybe it's according to the usuliyin or according to the fuqaha. So Ibn Hajar rahmallah mentions the second view by saying وَقِيلَ الْحَدِيثُ مَا جَاءَ عَنِ النَّبِيِّ صَلَى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ وَالْخَبْرُ مَا جَاءَ عَنْ غَيْرِهِ. It is said that hadith is that which comes from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and khabar is that which comes from anyone else besides the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or something that is attributed to someone else besides the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So according to this view, the word khabar and the word hadith are two opposites. So whereas the hadith refers to that which is being transmitted from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam alone, the word khabar is used for that which is narrated from others besides the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So based on this view, if something is related from a sahabi, then it cannot be labeled, it cannot be called a hadith. And if something is related from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then it cannot be called a khabar. ومن ثم قيل لمن يشتغل بالتواريخ وما شاكلها الإخباري ولمن يشتغل بالسنة النبوية المحدث. Hence, it is said that the one who is occupied with history and other subjects which are similar to it. So, for example, maybe in storytelling, etc., then that person will be called an akhbari. And the one who is occupied with the prophetic traditions, then only he will be given the title of muhaddith. So here Ibn Hajar rahmallah used the word وَمِن ثَمَّ. Alam al-Qani rahmallah, he explains this هو بفتح المثلثة أصله اسم إشارة للمكان البعيد زيدت عليه التاء للتأنيث اللفظ ثم استعير للتعليل أي من أجل التباين بين الحديث والخبر قيل. And therefore we translated it as the word hence. So when he says that which is similar to it, وَمَا شَاكَلَا, then like we said, it refers to those who tell tales of the past or ancient anecdotes, or they mention the statements of other scholars of the past, etc. So such a person will be called al-akhbari. Wal-akhbari al-mu'arrikh. نصب للفظ الأخبار كالأنصار والأنماط وشبههما. In short, according to this view, it is only a hadith. The word hadith can only be used if it is ascribing something from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. فلا يشمله إلا ما كان مرفوعا بقرينة المقابل وبقرينة قوله ومن ثم وعلى هذا القيل بينهما تباين. So that means between hadith and between khabar there is total tabayun. Both are opposites. So the first view was that they synonyms, they have the same meaning. The second view is that they are opposites. The third is وقيل بينهما عموم وخصوص مطلق. So now we'll explain this term shortly. فَكُلُّ حَدِيثٍ خَبْرٌ. So every hadith is a khabar, but not every khabar is a hadith. And therefore, Ibn Hajar used the word khabar so that it could be more comprehensive and more encompassing. So this means that between khabar and hadith there is umum wa khusus mutlaq. Now, umum wa khusus mutlaq is when we have two words and one word fully encompasses and incorporates the other, but the other word does not fully incorporate the former word. So to understand this, we may look at the example that Shaykh Nuruddin Itr gives in the footnotes. He said, وَهُوَ يَكُونَ أَحَدُ اللَّفْظَيْنِ دَالًا عَلَى كُلِّ مَعْنَى الْآخَرِ وَزِيَادَ عَلَيْهِ. That one word fully encompasses the other and even more. Now you say, look at this example of insan and mu'min. So when you say a human being, then it does not incorporate every, when you use the word human being, then it will refer to those who are Muslims and those who are non-Muslims. But when you refer to the word Muslim, then it does not refer to each and every human being. So you can see one fully incorporates the other, but the other does not incorporate this one. So every Muslim is a human being, but not every human is a Muslim. In this example, the word Muslim is specific, so that's where you're getting your khusus, and the word human is general. Proponents of this view suggest that hadith is specific while khabar is general. So that means a khabar will incorporate everyone's statements. So whether it is the words of the Prophet ﷺ, whether it is the words of the Sahaba, everybody's statements will come under a khabar. But hadith is specific only to that which is attributed to the Prophet ﷺ. So in short, there are three views amongst the scholars. The easiest way to memorize these is as follows: that al-khabru muradifun lil hadith. That's the first view. Al-khabru mughayirun lil hadith. That's the second. And al-khabru a'ammu min al-hadith. That khabar is more general than hadith. In light of all of this, you can also note the wisdom of Ibn Hajar rahmallah, that he used the word khabar because this term encompasses all three views. So he says, وَعَبَّرَ هُنَا بِالْخَبْرِ لِيَكُونَ أَشْمَلِ. That he used the word khabar so that it's more comprehensive, it incorporates all three views. So whether a person prefers the second view or the third view, even though Ibn Hajar rahmallah personally preferred the first view, he used the word khabar so that if those who prefer the second or third view read the book, they will understand that it refers to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When teaching this to his students, Hafiz Ibn Hajar rahimahullah said, قولي ليكون أشمل باعتبار الأقوال فأما على الأول فواضح. From the first one you can understand very clearly that it will refer to everything attributed to the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. وأما على الثالث فلأن الخبر أعم مطلقا. That khabar definitely also incorporates whatever is transmitted from the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم كما ثبت الأعم ثبت الأخص. وأما على الثاني فلأنه إذا اعتبرت هذه الأمور في الخبر الذي هو وارد عن غير النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فلا يعتبر ذلك فيما ورد عنه وهو الحديث من باب الأولى. Now that's what a person might have difficulty in understanding, but that how will the second, if he's taken using the word khabar, then the second view means that it refers to everything besides the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Ibn Hajar is saying that if you have to take so much care and so much caution for the statements and actions and transmitting from things from others besides the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, فلا يعتبر ذلك فيما ورد عنه وهو الحديث من باب الأولى. Then all the more reason that you will have to take that amount of care from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Inshallah, we'll stop the lesson here. Subhanallah wa bihamdi, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta.